The morning of February 18, 1820, dawned cold and gray over Charleston, South Carolina. Nearly 2,000 people had gathered outside the old city jail, their breath-forming clouds in the winter air. They had come to witness something unprecedented in American history: the execution of a woman who would become known as the nation's first female serial killer. Lavinia Fisher stood on the gallows, defiant to the very end. According to witnesses, she wore a white dress that morning, though whether it was truly her wedding gown, as legend claims, remains a mystery lost to time. The crowd fell silent as she was asked for her final words. What she said next would echo through history, cementing her place in American criminal law. "If you have a message you want to send to hell," she reportedly declared, "give it to me, for I'll be going there directly." But the woman who stood before that crowd was not the monster that legend would make her out to be. The real story of Lavinia Fisher is far more complex, tragic, and ultimately more fascinating than the myths that have grown around her name. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about America's early criminal history and raises uncomfortable questions about justice, truth, and the power of legend over fact. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into America's most fascinating criminal cases. The story of Lavinia Fisher begins not with murder, but with mystery. Born around 1793, likely in Charleston, South Carolina, Lavinia entered the world during a time when the young United States was still finding its identity. The Charleston of her youth was a bustling port city, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where the wealthy elite lived alongside the desperately poor, and where the line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was often blurred. Little is known about Lavinia's early life. Historical records from the late 18th century, particularly those concerning women of modest means, are sparse and often unreliable. What we do know paints a picture of a woman who would have grown up in a world vastly different from our own, where life was harsh, justice was swift, and survival often depended on one's ability to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. Charleston in the early 1800s was a city of contrasts. The wealthy plantation owners who controlled the rice and cotton trade lived in magnificent mansions along the waterfront. Their wealth built on the backs of enslaved people who made up nearly half the city's population. But beyond the grand facades and manicured gardens lay a grittier reality. The city was also home to sailors, merchants, craftsmen, and a growing population of free people of color who navigated the complex social hierarchies of the antebellum South. For a young woman like Lavinia, options were limited. Marriage was often the only path to security, and choosing the wrong partner could mean the difference between a comfortable life and a desperate struggle for survival. Unfortunately for Lavinia, her choice of husband would ultimately lead her down a path that would end at the gallows. John Fisher was everything a respectable Charleston family would have warned their daughters against. A drifter and petty criminal, he possessed the kind of dangerous charm that could convince people to trust him, even when they shouldn't. When Lavinia married him, she was entering into a partnership that would define the rest of her short life. The couple's criminal enterprise began modestly enough. They established themselves as proprietors of the 6 Mile Wayfarer House, an inn located approximately 6 miles outside of Charleston's city center. In the early 1800s, such establishments served as crucial waypoints for travelers moving between cities. The roads were dangerous, and a safe place to rest for the night was a valuable commodity. The 6 Mile House, as it came to be known, was strategically positioned along the main road leading into Charleston. Travelers approaching the city after dark would often stop there for the night, planning to complete their journey in the morning. For the Fishers, these weary travelers represented opportunity. The inn itself was a modest 2-story building, unremarkable in appearance but perfectly suited to their purposes. According to later accounts, it featured a common room where guests could eat and socialize, private sleeping quarters upstairs, and if the legends are to be believed, hidden chambers where dark deeds were carried out. But it's important to understand that the 6 Mile House was not just a business venture for the Fishers. It was the headquarters of a criminal organization that would terrorize the Charleston area for years. The inn provided the perfect cover for their operations, allowing them to identify wealthy targets, plan robberies, and dispose of evidence all under the guise of legitimate hospitality. The legend of Lavinia Fisher has grown considerably over the past 2 centuries, taking on a life of its own that often bears little resemblance to the historical facts. According to the most popular version of the story, Lavinia was a master manipulator who would greet arriving guests with southern charm and hospitality, offering them a special tea made from oleander leaves. This poisonous concoction would render her victims unconscious, allowing her husband, John, to rob and murder them while they slept. The tale goes on to describe how John would then dispose of the bodies through a trap door in the guest rooms, dropping them into secret chambers beneath the inn, where he would dismember them and bury the remains. When authorities finally raided the 6 Mile House, they allegedly discovered dozens of skeletons hidden beneath the floorboards, evidence of years of systematic murder. This version of events has been repeated countless times in books, articles, and ghost tours throughout Charleston. It's a story that has all the elements of a perfect crime thriller, a beautiful but deadly woman, a diabolical murder method, and a house of horrors that would make even Edgar Allan Poe proud. However, historical evidence tells a very different story. Modern historians and researchers who have examined the primary sources from the case have found no evidence that the Fishers ever murdered anyone. No skeletons were found beneath the 6 Mile House. No trapdoors were discovered in the guest rooms, and no witnesses ever testified to seeing poisoned tea or secret chambers. What did happen was far more mundane but no less criminal. The Fishers were part of a gang of highway robbers who terrorized travelers in the Charleston area. They would use their inn as a base of operations, gathering information about wealthy guests and their travel plans, then ambushing them on the road. It was a dangerous and illegal enterprise, but it was robbery, not murder. The Fisher gang operated with a level of organization and sophistication that was unusual for the time. They had established an extensive network of informants and accomplices who would provide them with information about potential targets. When a wealthy merchant or planter stayed at the 6 Mile House, the Fishes would learn about their business, their travel plans, and most importantly, how much money they were carrying. The gang's methods were brutal but effective. They would typically attack their victims on isolated stretches of road, using overwhelming force to subdue them quickly. The robberies were carried out with military precision, suggesting that some members of the gang may have had experience in organized violence, perhaps as veterans of the War of 1812. Lavinia's role in these operations was likely more significant than that of a typical criminal's wife. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, charismatic, and ruthless. She was reportedly the one who would gather information from unsuspecting guests, using her charm and hospitality to lower their guard. She would learn their names, their destinations, and their business affairs, all while serving them dinner and making pleasant conversation. But Lavinia was also directly involved in the violent aspects of the gang's operations. Court records show that she was present during at least one robbery, and witnesses described her as an active participant in the violence. This was not a woman who was merely an accessory to her husband's crimes. She was a full partner in the criminal enterprise. The gang's activities created a climate of fear in the Charleston area. Travelers began to avoid the roads at night, and those who had to travel took elaborate precautions to protect themselves. The local authorities were under increasing pressure to do something about the robberies, but the gang had been careful to avoid leaving witnesses who could identify them. The beginning of the end for the Fisher gang came in early 1819 when they targeted a traveler named David Ross. Ross was a young man from Tennessee who was traveling to Charleston on business. Like many travelers of the era, he had heard rumors about highway robberies in the area, but he had little choice but to continue his journey. Ross arrived at the 6M house on the evening of February 17, 1819, exactly 1 year before the Fishers would meet their fate on the gallows. He was greeted by Lavinia, who welcomed him warmly and offered him food and lodging for the night. Ross later testified that he found her to be charming and hospitable, though he noticed something unsettling about her manner that he couldn't quite put his finger on. What happened next would become the key evidence in the case against the Fishers. According to Ross's later testimony, Lavinia offered him a special tea that she claimed would help him sleep better. Ross, already suspicious, declined the drink, and instead pretended to drink it while secretly disposing of the liquid. He then retired to his room, but instead of sleeping, he remained awake and alert. In the early hours of the morning, Ross heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room. He positioned himself behind the door and waited. When the door opened, he saw a figure entering his room with what appeared to be a weapon. Ross managed to escape through the window and fled into the night, but his ordeal was far from over. The next morning, as Ross was making his way toward Charleston, he was attacked by two men who dragged him before a group of people that included Lavinia Fisher. Ross looked to Lavinia for help, believing that as a woman she would show him mercy. Instead, she attacked him herself, choking him and smashing his head through a window before he managed to escape. Ross immediately reported the incident to the authorities in Charleston, providing them with detailed descriptions of his attackers and the location of the 6 Mile House. His testimony would prove to be the crucial evidence that authorities needed to move against the Fisher gang. The Charleston authorities took Ross's accusations seriously. The highway robberies had been a persistent problem in the area, and they finally had a witness who could identify the perpetrators. A warrant was issued for the arrest of John and Lavinia Fisher, along with several of their known associates. However, the Fishers had been warned that the authorities were coming. By the time law enforcement arrived at the 6 Mile House, the gang had fled. The abandoned inn was searched thoroughly, but investigators found no evidence of the murders that legend would later attribute to the Fishers. There were no trapdoors, no secret chambers, and no buried bodies. The search for the fugitives lasted for several months. The Fishers and their associates had scattered, some fleeing to other states, others hiding in the swamps and forests around Charleston. The authorities offered rewards for information leading to their capture, and slowly the members of the gang were tracked down and arrested. John and Lavinia Fisher were finally captured in the summer of 1819. They were brought back to Charleston and imprisoned in the old city jail to await trial. The jail, built in 1802, was a forbidding stone structure that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in South Carolina. It would be the Fishers' home for the final months of their lives. The investigation that followed their arrest revealed the extent of the gang's operations. Authorities discovered that the Fishers had been involved in numerous robberies over a period of several years. They had targeted dozens of victims, stealing thousands of dollars in cash and valuables. The scale of their criminal enterprise was far greater than anyone had initially suspected. The trial of John and Lavinia Fisher began in the fall of 1819. The case attracted enormous attention throughout South Carolina and beyond. The idea of a woman being tried for highway robbery was almost unprecedented, and the public was fascinated by the story of the criminal couple who had terrorized travelers for so long. The prosecution's case was built primarily on the testimony of David Ross, who described his experiences at the 6 Mile House and his subsequent attack in vivid detail. Ross proved to be a compelling witness, and his account of events was corroborated by other evidence that the authorities had gathered during their investigation. The defense faced an uphill battle. John and Lavinia Fisher were clearly guilty of the crimes they were accused of, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their lawyers attempted to argue that the couple had been coerced into their criminal activities by other members of the gang, but this argument was undermined by testimony that showed Lavinia in particular had been a willing and active participant in the robberies. The trial also revealed details about the gang's methods and organization. Witnesses testified about the systematic way in which the Fishers had gathered information about their victims, the careful planning that went into each robbery, and the violence that they were willing to use to achieve their goals. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against Lavinia was her own behavior during the attack on David Ross. Multiple witnesses testified that she had not only participated in the robbery, but had actually been more violent than some of the male members of the gang. This testimony shattered any possibility that she could be portrayed as a victim of her husband's influence. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict. John and Lavinia Fisher were found guilty of highway robbery, a capital offense under South Carolina law at the time. The judge sentenced them both to death by hanging to be carried out on February 18, 1820. The sentences were controversial, Not because there was any doubt about the Fishers' guilt, but because many people felt that executing a woman was inappropriate, regardless of her crimes. There were several attempts to have Lavinia's sentence commuted to life imprisonment, but these efforts were unsuccessful. The other members of the gang received various sentences. Some were also sentenced to death, while others received long prison terms. The authorities were determined to send a message that highway robbery would not be tolerated in South Carolina, and they wanted to make an example of the Fisher gang. In the months leading up to their execution, both John and Lavinia Fisher maintained their innocence of any murders, though they eventually admitted to the robberies. John, in particular, seemed to find religion during his time in prison, and he spent his final weeks attempting to repent for his crimes. Lavinia, on the other hand, remained defiant to the end. She refused to admit that she had done anything wrong, and she showed no remorse for her actions. Her attitude only served to reinforce the public's perception of her as a dangerous and unrepentant criminal. The execution of John and Lavinia Fisher on February 18, 1820, was one of the most well-attended public events in Charleston's history. Nearly 2,000 people gathered to witness the hanging, making it a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The crowd included people from all walks of life. Wealthy plantation owners stood alongside common laborers, all united in their fascination with the criminal couple who had terrorized their community. The execution was seen as a form of justice, but it was also entertainment, a final act in a drama that had captivated the public for months. John Fisher was the first to be executed. In his final moments, he reportedly expressed remorse for his crimes and asked for forgiveness from God and the people he had wronged. He was said to have accepted his fate with resignation, perhaps even relief. Lavinia's execution was more dramatic. According to witnesses, she maintained her defiant attitude to the very end. When asked if she had any final words, she allegedly made her famous declaration about carrying messages to hell. Whether she actually said these words or whether they were added to the story later by people who wanted to enhance the legend is unknown. The manner of her death would also become the subject of legend. Some accounts claimed that she wore her wedding dress to the execution, though this seems unlikely given that her home had been destroyed and she had been in prison for months. Others say that she jumped from the gallows herself, rather than wait for the hangman, though this detail also appears to be a later addition to the story. What is certain is that the execution of Lavinia Fisher marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal enterprises in early American history. It also marked the beginning of a legend that would grow and evolve over the centuries, transforming a highway robber into America's first female serial killer. In the years following their execution, the story of John and Lavinia Fisher began to change. The mundane reality of highway robbery was gradually transformed into something far more sinister and dramatic. The couple became serial killers. Their inn became a house of horrors, and their crimes became the stuff of nightmares. This transformation was not accidental. In the 19th century, there was a growing appetite for sensational crime stories, and publishers were eager to provide content that would satisfy this demand. The story of the Fishers was perfect material for this type of literature, and it was embellished and expanded with each retelling. The legend of Lavinia Fisher also tapped into deep-seated fears about women who violated social norms. In the early 1800s, women were expected to be passive, nurturing, and subordinate to men. The idea of a woman who was violent, manipulative, and criminal was both fascinating and terrifying to the public. Over time, Thestry acquired new details that made it more compelling, but less accurate. The poisoned tea, the trapdoors, the secret chambers, and the dozens of murdered victims were all additions that enhanced the story's dramatic impact, but had no basis in historical fact. The transformation of Lavinia Fisher from highway robber to serial killer was also influenced by the location of her crimes. Charleston was a city with a rich history and a reputation for ghostly tales. The story of the 6 Mile House fit perfectly into this tradition, and it was eagerly adopted by tour guides and storytellers who saw its commercial potential. Modern historians who have examined the primary sources related to the Fisher case have found no evidence to support the serial killer narrative. The court records, newspaper accounts, and witness testimonies from the time all point to the same conclusion. John and Lavinia Fisher were highway robbers, not murderers. The lack of evidence for the murder claims is striking. If the Fishers had actually killed dozens of people, there would be some record of missing persons, some evidence of bodies, some testimony from witnesses. Instead, there is nothing. The only crime that can be definitively proven against them is highway robbery, which was certainly serious enough to warrant their execution under the laws of the time. The absence of evidence has not stopped the legend from growing. Today, Lavinia Fisher is still widely regarded as America's first female serial killer, and the story of the 6 Mile House continues to be told on ghost tours and in true crime books. The legend has become more powerful than the truth, and it seems unlikely that historical facts will ever fully dislodge it from the public consciousness. This raises important questions about how we remember and interpret the past. The story of Lavinia Fisher reveals how legends can grow around historical figures, transforming them into something they never were. It also shows how our fascination with crime and violence can lead us to embrace sensational stories over mundane realities. The case of John and Lavinia Fisher had significant implications for law enforcement and criminal justice in early 19th century South Carolina. Their arrest and execution demonstrated that the authorities were willing and able to pursue criminals who operated outside the traditional boundaries of Charleston society. The Fisher case also highlighted the problems of highway robbery in the antebellum South. The couple's criminal enterprise was possible because of the isolated nature of the roads around Charleston and the lack of effective law enforcement in rural areas. Their case led to increased patrols and better coordination between local authorities. From a legal perspective, the execution of Lavinia Fisher was significant because it established the precedent that women could be held fully accountable for their crimes, even those that were traditionally associated with men. This was an important step in the evolution of women's legal status, though it came at a terrible cost. The case also had cultural implications that extended far beyond South Carolina. The story of Lavinia Fisher became part of American folklore, contributing to the development of what would later become the true crime genre. The fascination with her story revealed something about the American psyche and our relationship with crime and punishment. Today, the legacy of Lavinia Fisher continues to influence how we think about female criminals and the nature of evil. Her story, whether true or false, has become part of the collective memory of American crime, and it continues to be told and retold in new forms for new audiences. The execution of John and Lavinia Fisher brought an end to the reign of terror that had plagued the Charleston area for several years. The surviving members of their gang were either executed or imprisoned, and the roads around the city became safer for travelers. The 6 Mile House itself was eventually destroyed, though the exact circumstances of its destruction are unclear. Some accounts suggest that it was burned down by angry citizens who wanted to erase all traces of the Fisher gang's activities. Others claim that it simply fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. The site where the inn once stood is now occupied by other buildings, but the memory of what happened there continues to haunt the area. Local folklore maintains that the spirits of the Fishes and their victims still roam the grounds, and the location remains a popular destination for ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. The broader implications of the Fisher case extend beyond the immediate impact on Charleston society. Their story represents a fascinating example of how historical truth can be transformed by legend, and how our desire for sensational stories can overwhelm our commitment to factual accuracy. In the end, the real story of Lavinia Fisher may be more interesting than the legend that has grown around her. She was a woman who lived in a time when options were limited and survival often required, making difficult choices. Her decision to become a criminal was undoubtedly wrong, but it was also a product of the circumstances in which she found herself. The fact that she became a full partner in her husband's criminal enterprise rather than merely an accessory to his crimes suggests a level of agency and independence that was unusual for women of her era. This may be why her story has proven so enduring, and why it continues to fascinate people more than 2 centuries after her death. Whether we remember her as a highway robber or as a serial killer, Lavinia Fisher remains an important figure in American criminal history. Her story reminds us that the past is often more complex and ambiguous than we would like to believe, and that the line between truth and legend is not always as clear as we might hope. Thanks for watching. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this.